You open the dusty pages of history. Sometimes there are moments that move the world like a storm. Today I am going to take you back to such a period. Under the warm winds of Spain, once upon a time, the majestic palaces of the Muslims rose, and the call to prayer echoed from the minarets. But these lands were not only the scene of splendor and tranquility, but also of conquests, battles of faith and turbulent events that changed the destiny of a people. On the one hand, the footsteps echoing through the stone streets of Granada. On the other, the determined gaze of Catholic monarchs. This was to be the last gasp, not just of a city, but of a civilization. But this story did not only end in destruction. The beginning of a new era was also written here. The rebuilding of churches, the transformation of faiths, and the great changes that shaped a nation's identity. Now step onto this stage of history, where light and shadows dance. Because this is a story of both an ending and a beginning. And in every line, echoes of the past whisper in the ears of the present. If you are ready, this journey from the fall of Granada to the dawn of the reforms begins. Listen to me, my friends. I am going to blow the sands of time and take you back to the late Middle Ages, those glorious and turbulent years. Think about it. Europe in the 15th century. Wealth and poverty are side by side in the streets. The shadows of majestic cathedrals cast over the homes of poor peasants. But these cathedrals were not just made of stone and mortar. The faith and fears of the people were built into their walls, because at that time there was an authority to which even kings knelt, to which the people surrendered their souls. Catholic Church. Why? The Church. If you only knew how powerful it was in those years. The papacy held not only religious, but also political power. Churches rose in every corner of Europe. Priests spoke as the voice of God. The wealth of the Church was beyond your imagination. Gold cups, silk cloths, sacred relics. People offered everything they had to pay their debt to God. Their fields, their homes, even their lives. But where did this wealth come from? This is where our story takes a dark turn. And the power of the Church was sometimes fueled not by the purity of faith, but by the shadow of fear and self-interest. Especially in the 15th century, some felt that this authority was beginning to crumble. Because something was changing, people were beginning to see something different behind the walls they thought were sacred. Corruption. I must tell you what poison corruption is. The priests invented a means of salvation called indulgences to exploit the faith of the people. Have you committed a sin? Don't worry. If you paid enough money, your sins would be forgiven. You could even skip the long and arduous walk to heaven and run straight into the arms of God. The indulgences were not just a piece of paper. They were commodities of commerce, selling the people's trust in God. With these sales, popes and priests built golden palaces for themselves and furnished their tables like kings. But those coffers full of gold were also the basis for the anger that was building up in the people. People began to question, did God really need money? Or was the Church deceiving the people under the guise of divine authority? It was these inquiries that created the first cracks in the seemingly unshakable foundations of the Church. Some dared to peer through these cracks and were horrified by what they saw. Peasants were struggling for a morsel of bread to feed themselves, while the leaders of the church, swimming in luxury, were paving the way to buy their way to heaven. What kind of justice was this? Demanded the Pope. But where would this unrest lead? One by one, as the light of the church began to fade in the eyes of the people, someone would look for a new ray of hope shining in the darkness. But who were they? And where would the courage come from? In our next story, you will witness the first sparks of this rebellion. Now, through the shadows of the past, let's move on to the next scene. My dear listeners, I will now take you through the mists of the Middle Ages to the threshold of an era of darkness and splendor. The power of the church was still felt throughout Europe, but now cracks were beginning to appear in the walls of its splendor. The questioning of the people was turning from whispers to noise, and the questioning of those who were seen as God's representatives was disturbing. It was at just such a time that two names appeared on the stage of history: John Wycliffe and Jan Hus. They were the first sparks of a storm that would create waves in the future. John Wycliffe, a man born in the green hills of England. To describe him merely as a thinker or a man of religion is not enough to tell his story, because Wycliffe was a revolutionary who believed in the power of ideas. He developed ideas to undermine the authority of the church, but his greatest battle was with words. For him, the word of God should not be hidden from the people. The Bible should not be the monopoly of priests who only knew Latin. Oh, what courage that was! Imagine, at that time, Latin was a language that only the elite could understand. But the peasants, the workers, the common people could not even dream of reading God's word in their own language. Wycliffe set out to realize this dream. He began translating the Bible into the languages of the people. Every letter, every word was a challenge to the authority of the church. For him, it was not just a translation, but a resistance. If the people read God's message in their own language, they would no longer be dependent on the church. They would be free from the control of the clergy. But this idea did not sit well with the church leaders. Wycliffe's ideas were seen as a threat. They did their best to blacken his name, but the fire of this wise man had already spread. And then Jan Hus, another brave voice from the bosom of the Czech lands. Hus was inspired by Wycliffe's ideas, but he adapted them to his own people and started a new movement. He preached in Prague, where his every word was like a spark. Hus criticized the wealth and corruption of the church and tried to awaken the people. His harsh criticism of indulgences in particular drew the ire of the church. But Hus did not back down. The people embraced him as a leader. The followers he won were so full of faith that even the threats of the church could not deter them. Hus's greatest passion was for the people to live religion according to their own understanding. His movement strengthened the national identity of the Czech people. It was not only a religious awakening, but also a cultural revival. But my friends, unfortunately, such brave voices could not speak freely for long at that time. Hus was put on trial for challenging the authority of the church, and eventually met a tragic end. But even as he was burned in the flames, his ideas were reborn from the ashes. Hus's death did not silence his thoughts. On the contrary, it strengthened them. So, my dear friends, how can the sparks of these two men become a forest fire? Who will dare to walk the path that Wycliffe and Hus paved? How will the cries of reform echo across Europe? These are the questions we will seek to answer in the next part of our story. But remember, this is just the beginning. My dear friends, let me turn the hourglass of time upside down and take you back to the late 15th century. These were the years when an era was drawing its last breaths, but also when new horizons were taking shape. On the Iberian Peninsula, two worlds, Christianity and Islam, had confronted, fought, and influenced each other for centuries. However, the final act of this long story was written with the Battle of Granada, 4 years of struggle within the U.S. and the Middle East. Between 1482 and 1492, the attacks on the last Muslim strongholds of the Muslims in these lands, led by the determination of the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, were not just a war, but a turning point that changed the course of history. The Emirate of Granada. How glorious this name once was. Hidden among the mountains and adorned with pomegranate trees, this land was the last refuge of Muslim Andalusia. The call to prayer, echoing through the streets of Granada, the splendor of the magnificent palaces, the craftsmanship and wisdom in the stones of the Alhambra were some of the deepest traces left by Islamic culture in Europe. But dear listener, this glorious city was on its last legs. In 1482, the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella embarked on a protracted war against the Emirate of Granada. This war was not just a military campaign. It also represented a major showdown in religion, politics, and culture. The Catholics wanted to reunite the Christian Iberian Peninsula and put an end to the Muslim presence. Boabdil, the young ruler of the Emirate of Granada, tried to resist this threat, but the division and weakness within the emirate made his task difficult. The years of war brought great suffering for both the Christian and Muslim sides. Step by step, the armies of Ferdinand and Isabella occupied the lands of Granada, while the Muslim population, overflowing from the mountains, was forced to flee their homelands. One by one, the cities fell: Malaga, Baza, Guadix. Each one of them diminished the power of the Emirate of Granada a little more. My dear friends, the people who lived under the magical lights of the Alhambra were now struggling with hunger, cold, and despair on the migration routes. The fall of Granada was written on the pages of history books not only as a victory but also as the end of a culture. In 1492, Boabdil signed the surrender agreement. Legend has it that as he was leaving the Alhambra, looking back, his mother said to him, "Don't cry like a woman, because you couldn't defend like a man." These words capture both the tragedy of Boabdil and the gravity of Granada's loss. This surrender marked the end of the Muslim presence on the Iberian Peninsula and at the same time ushered in a new era in European history. But my friends, this story does not end here. With the fall of Granada, not only Muslims but also Jews and other religious minorities were subjected to great persecution in Spain. What legacy did this persecution leave? And how did Ferdinand and Isabella's triumphant decisions change world history? Let's look for answers to these questions together in the next chapter. My dear friends, I will now tell you the story of the end of a great era and the birth of a nation. A story of ambition, faith, triumph, and pain. A time when a nation was united under a single flag from a fragmented land, but with new conflicts and challenges. This is the story of the end of the Reconquista and the beginning of Spain's emergence as a nation-state. By the late 15th century, two great powers had emerged on the Iberian Peninsula, Castile and Aragon. The union of these two kingdoms had both political and symbolic significance. The marriage of Queen Isabella of Castile and King Ferdinand of Aragon united not only the two dynasties, but also the fate of the Iberian Peninsula. Ferdinand and Isabella changed the course of history, not only through their marriage, but also through their leadership. In laying the foundations of a united Spain, they were driven by the strength of their faith and placed Christianity at the center of national identity. After the Battle of Granada, the Reconquista was complete. With the fall of the Muslim Emirate of Granada, the Christian-controlled territories of Spain were fully united. But this was not just a military victory. It was also an ideological victory. Ferdinand and Isabella used Christianity as a unifying force and began to build their national identity on this faith. During this period, Christianity in Spain became not just a religion, but an element that defined the soul of the nation. But, dear listeners, this unification came at a heavy price. The year 1492 is remembered not only for the fall of Granada, but also for the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. The hand of the Inquisition grew stronger and stronger, and Ferdinand and Isabella, in the name of maintaining religious purity, pursued a brutal policy against different faiths. Muslims and Jews were forced to convert to Christianity or leave their lands. In the process, Spain lost not only its territories but also its peoples, who had helped it to prosper culturally and economically for hundreds of years. However, this unification was a prelude to Spain becoming a great power on the world stage. The discovery of the New World took place under Ferdinand and Isabella's watch. The voyage of Christopher Columbus to the West in 1492 opened a new era in which Spain would not only dominate Europe, but the whole world. But my friends, have the riches and opportunities of this new era resolved the deep conflicts within Spain? And this is where our story takes a turn. But what kind of legacy did internal unrest and religious oppression leave in the wake of Spain's great victories? What conflicts did the order established by Ferdinand and Isabella lead to in the future of Spain? We will pursue these questions in the next episode. My dear friends, I will now take you to one of the darkest and most turbulent pages of history. In the Iberian Peninsula, where once faiths and cultures had managed to coexist, a time had begun when one voice, one faith dominated. The most powerful tool of this period was the Spanish Inquisition. Spain, under the rule of Ferdinand and Isabella, chose a difficult and ruthless path to ensure unity and religious purity. This path was aimed at transforming not only beliefs but also societies. Established in 1478 with the authorization of Pope Sixtus IV, the Spanish Inquisition was originally intended only to control the loyalty of former Jews and Muslims, conversos, and Moriscos, who had apparently converted to Christianity. But these tribunals soon came to symbolize much more than religious control. In the eyes of the Inquisition, not only those who worshipped wrongly, but any ideas and beliefs outside Christianity posed a threat to the unity of the kingdom. And that is why the grip of the courts has extended not only to the beliefs of individuals, but also to their lives, culture, and freedom. My dear listeners, the Inquisition courts operated in such a way that those tried in these courts were often declared guilty before they even had a chance to defend themselves. Witness testimonies were secret, evidence was not questioned, and confessions were usually extracted under torture. The most well-known symbol of the Inquisition was the auto da fe, the act of faith. public executions. These executions were organized not only as a religious purification, but also to intimidate the public. As people gathered in the squares, watching the punishment of those who had been declared sinners, the message of these demonstrations was clear. There was no place for anything but one faith. The situation for the Jewish and Muslim communities became increasingly dire. In 1492, immediately after the fall of Granada, Ferdinand and Isabella issued the famous Edict of Alhambra, ordering all Jews in Spain to convert to Christianity or leave the country. The result of this order was that thousands of Jews left behind their homes, their jobs, their culture, and set off into the unknown. Some found refuge in Portugal, others in the Ottoman Empire. But the void they left behind forever diminished the cultural richness of Spain. The same fate befell the Muslims in the years to come. From the early 16th century onwards, the Morisco population of Granada would be subjected to intense repression and eventually expelled from Spain altogether. But the Inquisition was not only a mechanism of repression of beliefs, it was also a tool Ferdinand and Isabella used to strengthen centralized authority. By instilling fear in local nobles, merchants, and intellectuals, they silenced any opposition to royal authority. The Inquisition was long-handed, sharp-eyed, and ruthless in its judgment. So much so that the shadow of the courts fell everywhere, from the palace to the peasantry, from the city to the countryside. People have become unable to trust their neighbors. Everyone lives in fear that one day their beliefs or behavior will be questioned. Our dear friends, the Inquisition was a time when not only beliefs were tested, but also humanity. But in the wake of this dark age, the winds of freedom and reform would begin to blow in other parts of Europe. Would these movements, born under the dark shadow of the Inquisition, be strong enough to lay the foundations of the modern world? We will look for the answer to this question in the next chapter. Ah, my dear friends, I will now take you to the sound of a hammer echoing through the depths of history. It was not just the sound of a scroll of thesis nailed to a church door, but the echo of a movement that would change the destiny of Europe. The year was 1517, and the place was Wittenberg, a small town in Germany. There, one man dared, with determination and conviction, to question the sacred order. That man was Martin Luther, a monk, a scholar, and perhaps most importantly, a man who could not silence the voice of his conscience. At that time, the power of the church was at its height. The papacy was the undisputed authority of the Christian world, and this authority, rising from Rome, controlled not only souls but also pockets. One of the main sources of income for the church was the sale of indulgences, which was quite common at the time. An indulgence was a kind of certificate of absolution, offered for the forgiveness of sins. People were promised that their souls, even those of their dead loved ones, would be saved from purgatory. However, this practice had become a scheme that took advantage of the poverty of the people, exploiting their hopes and fears. With these revenues, the church built magnificent buildings and consolidated its power. This is precisely what troubled Martin Luther's conscience. Luther had long been witnessing this corruption, thinking about how the church's doctrines contradicted the scriptures. The sale of indulgences was turning God's forgiveness into a commodity, eclipsing the essence of faith. And finally, Luther lost patience. He went to the door of Wittenberg Cathedral and nailed what became known as the 95 Theses. In these theses, he harshly criticized the sale of indulgences and other practices of the Church. Luther argued that the forgiveness of sins was only possible through God's grace. People's salvation could neither be bought with money nor sanctioned by an intermediary organization. My dear listeners, this seemingly simple act was actually the harbinger of a great storm. Luther's theses were quickly reproduced in the printing press, the most effective means of communication at the time, and spread across Europe. These ideas reached the ears of intellectuals, rulers, and ordinary people who had long been uncomfortable with the authority of the Church. Luther became not only a critic of the Church, but also the leader of a reform movement that changed the religious and political structure of Europe. But this movement was powerful enough to shake not only the Church, but the very fabric of society. Luther's courage was more than a spark. It was the beginning of a fire that would ignite a forest. But how this fire would grow into a revolution, how the Church and Europe would react to this revolt, was hidden in the depths of time. So, my dear friends, what kind of a test would Luther's bold action put the Church to? How would the Reformation change the future, not only of religion, but of a continent? We will look for answers to these questions in the next chapter. Ah, my dear friends, history shows us how sometimes a small spark can turn into a gigantic fire. Martin Luther's nail in Wittenberg shook not just a door, but the conscience of a continent. However, this change was not only due to Luther's courage. His ideas turned into a wave that spread rapidly and led to radical transformations. The biggest reason for this was the printing press, the most powerful communication tool of the period. The printing press was like a revolution at that time. Luther's 95 Theses were reproduced not only in German but also in Latin and other languages. As they circulated throughout Europe, they became not just doctrine, but a manifesto of defiance. People realized that these ideas were not only a challenge to the Church, but also a call to their own spiritual freedom. Thanks to the power of the printing press, Luther's words reached the ears not only of the elite, but also of ordinary peasants and artisans. These ideas were whispered in village cafes, town squares, and church meetings. It was not only a matter of faith, but also the beginning of a social movement. The people found their own hope and anger in Luther's ideas. The oppressive practices and economic exploitation of the Catholic Church had become an unbearable burden. The Reformation provided a channel for this century of accumulated discontent to explode. However, it resonated not only among ordinary people, but also among political leaders. The princes and nobles in Germany saw in Luther's ideas not only a religious change, but also an opportunity to gain power independent of the papacy. Protestantism soon became a symbol not only of faith, but also of a political stance. By siding with Luther, some princes gained popularity among their own people and were able to break free from the influence of Rome. But the Reformation was not limited to Luther's ideas. New leaders and new doctrines emerged all over Europe. One of these leaders was John Calvin, who lived in Geneva, Switzerland. Ah, Calvin. His ideas gave a completely new direction to the Reformation movement. Calvin was especially noted for his predestination, the belief that people's fate was predetermined by God. According to him, it was predetermined who would be saved and who would be condemned to eternal damnation. This led people to question their faith and think more deeply about their own moral responsibility. Under Calvin's leadership, Geneva became the new center of the Reformation. Calvinism took root not only in Switzerland, but also in France, the Netherlands, and Scotland. Although Protestantism and Calvinism are the most familiar faces of the Reformation, the movement took on its own identity in different parts of Europe. While Anglicanism was born in England, different Protestant denominations emerged in other countries. Each took a different shape in its own social and political context. While advocating religious freedom, the Reformation was no longer just a struggle of faith, but a revolution that profoundly changed the cultural, political, and social fabric of Europe. So, my dear friends, as this wave of change took root deep in Europe, how would the Catholic Church respond to this challenge? Would the Church choose to repair this great rift, or would it seek a new order within itself? The answer to these questions will take us into the stormy waters of the Counter-Reformation movement. Ah, my friends, history sometimes tells how the closing of a door not only marks the end of a new era, but the fate of a people. The year 1492, with the fall of Granada, the centuries-old Muslim rule of Andalusia came to an end, and the remnants of an era were etched in the stones of history. However, the silence that followed this victory would witness the brutal erasure not only of wars, but also of identities and cultures. For Muslims, this new era was not the beginning of a surrender, but of a forced transformation. For the Muslim population, the fall of Granada was not only a loss of territory, but also a religious and cultural struggle for existence. Muslims were now called Moriscos, a name that symbolized that they were forced to adopt a new identity. Ferdinand and Isabella, determined to ensure the integrity of Christian Spain, ordered the Moriscos to either convert and become Christians or leave their lands. On the surface, this looks like a choice, but in fact there was no real choice, because leaving your homeland meant leaving your roots, your memories, and your life behind. Ah, my dear friends, the pressures faced by the Moriscos were not limited to a matter of conversion. These newly converted Christians were still viewed with suspicion in society. Their sincerity was doubted. Their worship was forbidden. Their customs despised. Even speaking Arabic was criminalized. A cultural cleansing was launched to remove all reminders of their old life. Manuscripts were burned, mosques were turned into churches, and centuries of knowledge, art, and architecture were destroyed. However, despite all these pressures, the Moriscos never gave up their struggle to preserve their identity. Sometimes they prayed in secret. Sometimes they tried to keep their old traditions alive inside their homes. The fall of Granada had a profound impact not only on Muslims, but also on Spain's ancient Jewish community. In 1492, the Decree of Alhambra, issued by Ferdinand and Isabella, gave the Jews an ultimatum: convert to Christianity or be exiled from Spain. Unlike the Muslims, however, this decision left the Jews with almost no real choice. Jews had been living on the Iberian Peninsula for centuries, building a well-established community and playing important roles in science, art, and commerce. Now, all this accumulation was to be erased overnight.
Everyone is indeed.
Ah, those roads of exile. Thousands of Jews were forced to leave Spain, leaving behind their homes, their homeland, and their history. Many chose to seek refuge in more tolerant lands, such as the Ottoman Empire. But this exodus was not just a physical act. It was also a trauma that left a deep mark on Europe's Jewish communities. In their destinations, they tried to build a new life with the cultural riches they had brought with them from Spain. But this was not enough to erase the traces of homesickness and the persecution they were subjected to. Now, I would like to ask you, my friends, when Spain took such a harsh course in the name of religious unity, did it know how these practices would lead to a rift within itself? Was this story, which began with the fall of Granada, Spain's attempt to turn itself into an empire, or was it the loss of the potential hidden in richness and diversity? In the next chapter, we will look for answers to these questions together. Ah, dear friends, imagine 16th century Europe. The air is more tense than ever. People are searching for the truth, looking both at each other and within themselves. The clash of swords mingles with the ringing of church bells. The proclamations on the walls and the squares both intrigue and frighten. The Reformation had begun with Martin Luther's bold move in Wittenberg. But now the ripple effect of this movement resembles a river. Each drop of water opened a new crack and turned into bigger currents. The Reformation was not just a change of thought or a change of religion. No, it was much more than that. Like a howling wind, it reached the four corners of Europe and affected not only those who sat in the pews, but also the kings on their thrones and the peasants in their shackles. Every class and every man had to decide what to do with this new religious understanding. Some embraced the idea of Protestantism, a movement that promised independence and spiritual freedom, giving them hope of a direct connection with God. For others, however, the idea was nothing less than a betrayal of the Church's sacred authority. Just like that, Europe was being drawn into sectarian conflicts. Germany was at the center of this storm. It was here that Luther's ideas were born and began to flourish. But let us not forget that this land also carried a great weight. As one of the centers of the Roman Empire, Germany was one of the regions where the authority of the Church was strongest. Nevertheless, as Luther's teaching spread rapidly thanks to the printing presses, people began to dream of freedom from centuries of religious oppression. Impressionism, especially among nobles and princes. Protestantism was not just a matter of faith, it was also a political tool. The desire to seize church lands, to gain independence from the papacy, and even to increase their power was another burning dimension of this conflict. Wars of religion. Oh, so many innocent lives were lost in their shadow. In Germany's countryside, small villages and big cities, brothers and sisters turned against each other. These wars between Protestants and Catholics were not just a matter of faith. Everyone was affected, from the farmer in the fields to the monarch in his palace. In 1546, the Schmalkaldic War broke out. An alliance of Protestant princes fought against the armies of the Holy Roman Emperor Karl V. It was a clash of power and interests as much as of faith. Blood was shed, churches were looted, people were driven out or enslaved. While both sides claimed that God was on their side, the people had to pay the price for this divine justice. In the end, there were no winners or losers, only destruction and exhaustion. This historic treaty, known as the Peace of Augsburg, signed in 1555, offered Germany a relative breathing space. It officially recognized the Protestant faith, known as Lutheranism, and gave princes the power to decide which religion they would adopt in their territories. Cavus regio, eius religio, whose rule, his religion. But did the so-called peace bring complete tranquility, dear friends? No, it was only a temporary pause in the fighting. Even though the peace treaty was signed, religious tensions ran deep, and in other parts of Europe, these sparks were about to ignite new fires. Augsburg was indeed a moment of respite, but how did these conflicts play out in the rest of Europe? How did it play out in France, Switzerland, even Scandinavia? And how did this religious conversion contribute to the shaping of nations? Now let's sail to another corner of Europe and discover together where else the flames of Protestantism are flickering. My friends, there was once a time in Europe when faith and authority were shaken, when deep suspicions were raised among the people, when the Reformation movement was ignited by the bold words of Martin Luther and ignited across Europe. The Catholic Church found itself on the edge of a precipice. Ultimately, if we can increase the momentum towards Catholic choice, its centuries-old authority was being challenged, its teachings were being questioned, and most importantly, the moral and material ascendancy of the Church over the people was being seriously undermined. It was at such a time that the Catholic world began to look for ways to restructure itself in order to respond to this crisis. And that response was called the Council of Trent, convened in 1545 in Trent, Italy, with a large turnout. The council continued slowly but steadily for nearly 18 years. The most influential cardinals, bishops, and theologians of the time came together to discuss not only ways to stop the Reform movement, but also the problems facing the Catholic Church itself. Can you imagine the atmosphere in the great halls, under high ceilings decorated with frescoes? Every word that came out of every mouth in this sacred assembly was destined to set a new course for the fate of the Church. However, it was not only religious issues that were discussed here. Battles for power, interests, and authority were also an invisible part of this atmosphere. The council began by clarifying some doctrines that had been the target of Luther's attacks. On issues such as which doctrines were to be considered sacred and how Scripture was to be interpreted, the Church made its position clear. For example, while Protestantism held that the Scriptures alone were authoritative, the Council of Trent rejected this and stated unequivocally that tradition also had sacred authority. And you may clarify that any law against believing in holy water. At the same time, they re-emphasized that good works and sacraments are an integral part of salvation, in contrast to the Protestant view of faith alone in the matter of human salvation. These decisions served as a shield to ensure that the Church stood like a solid rock. Of course, dear friends, do not think that this council dealt only with religious matters. The corruption within the Church had become too great a wound to be hidden any longer. Perhaps the most damaging to public confidence in the Church was the infamous sale of indulgences. Imagine a peasant or a rich nobleman who wanted to be absolved of his sins thought he could save himself by buying these certificates of spiritual absolution. For many, however, this practice was a symbol of religious scandal. The Council of Trent finally put an end to this problem and banned the sale of indulgences. It was declared that the forgiveness of sins could no longer be bought with money. The time had come for reforms within the Church, and for this reason, strict discipline was imposed on the clergy. The presence of bishops at their posts, increasing the level of education of priests, the organization of church buildings, all of these were decided in these long meetings. But let us not forget that the Council of Trent not only made adjustments within the Church, but also built a solid shield to protect the Catholic faith against attacks from outside. Art and architecture became an integral part of this struggle. In what is known as the Counter-Reformation period, the splendor of Baroque art was brought to bear to convey the Church's message. The majestic churches, the impressive paintings, and the imposing statues were intended to once again establish the power of the Catholic faith in the hearts of the people. Many modern sculptures compare the Catholic faith to the apparel of a glamorous rising city or a faithful woman. Ah, my friends, the Council of Trent was one of the most important turning points in the history of the Catholic Church. But one question still haunts us. Where did Protestantism go in this struggle, now that the Church had strengthened itself so much? How did the soul of Europe take shape in the midst of so much conflict? Here, in the next stop, we will explore the repercussions of the reforms in Europe and the Protestant world's response to this great challenge. So, are you ready for this journey? Ah, dear friends. Now close your eyes and imagine in your mind's eye Spain, in the far west of Europe, beyond the immense mountains and vast plains. Towards the end of the 15th century, this land was becoming a unity and a power in the name of Christianity. It all began with the sacramental union of Queen Isabel of Castile and King Ferdinand of Aragon, known as the Catholic monarchs. This marriage united not only two dynasties, but also the religious and political future of Spain. And so the foundations were laid for a golden age, unparalleled in history. One of the most striking features of this period was the kingdom's attempt to consolidate its authority by using religious beliefs as a shield, even as a spear. The relationship between the church and the crown was so close that it helped Spain to maintain absolute control over the peoples within its borders and to strike fear into the hearts of Europe. First of all, Isabel and Ferdinand acted with great determination to direct the loyalty of their people not only to royal authority but also to the Catholic faith. It was like a holy mission, as if God had given them the mission to establish a heaven on earth for Christianity. Ah, remember the fall of Granada, the last remnant of Muslim Andalusia. The city became a symbol of Spain's religious and political power when it was conquered for Christianity in 1492. This victory made the Catholic rulers a legend, not only in their own lands, but also throughout Europe. The triumphal shouts from Granada's magnificent Alhambra Palace heralded the triumph of the Catholic faith. But this was only the beginning. After the conquests, Isabel and Ferdinand ordered the Jews and Muslims living in the kingdom to convert to Christianity or leave the country. It was at this point that the dark shadow of the Inquisition began to envelop the whole of Spain. The Spanish Inquisition was not only a religious court, but also an apparatus of fear that consolidated royal authority. Great strides were made in these lands, not only in the name of religion, but also in the name of wealth. The discovery of America made Spain the world's economic superpower. Who can forget the voyage of Christopher Columbus? While gold and silver from the New World flowed into the royal treasury, this wealth also strengthened the church. The ties between the crown and the church were now too tight to be separated. Spain became one of the strongest supporters of the Catholic Church and was known as the bastion of Catholicism in Europe. Even other Catholic monarchs across the continent lined up to support Spain. What about the church? In this golden age, the church was more than just a spiritual authority. As a loyal ally of the Spanish crown, it had a powerful voice in everything from education to the arts, from laws to everyday life. The clergy advised the royal courts and preached sermons to shape the beliefs of the people. The power of the church began to dominate not only people's souls, but also their minds. Moreover, the splendor of churches and monasteries became architectural symbols of Spain's golden age. Each one was built like a prayer ascending to the heavens. reinforcing the faith of the faithful. But my friends, stop for a moment and think, can such a glorious power last forever? How solid were the foundations laid during this period? What dangers lurked behind Spain's great victories? Ah, my friends, listen and imagine a melody of deep sadness echoing across the stage of Spain's history. It was the early 17th century, and while Spain was proud to be a state that saw itself as the holy bastion of Catholicism, it was also feeling the pangs of a growing unrest. In this story, it was the people known as Moriscos who felt the hard blows of fate the hardest. The Moriscos were the descendants of the Andalusian people who tried to preserve the identity of their Muslim ancestors but were forcibly Christianized. A bridge to Andalusia's glorious past. They had lived for centuries in Spain's most fertile lands, breathing life into the country with their olive groves, orchards, and trade networks. Unfortunately for the Spanish monarchy, the religious difference was a wound that would never heal. After the fall of Granada, all the repression and forced baptisms made the Moriscos only nominally Catholic. The government and the church constantly doubted their loyalty. By 1609, King Felipe III and his advisors believed that expelling these people would cleanse Spain. But my friends, to tear away such a profound part of the cultural fabric of a society is not only a cleansing, it is also to undermine the very soul of a country. The decision was harsh and irreversible. Moriscos of all ages were escorted out of villages, towns, and cities by soldiers. They had never been trusted, and now as they were uprooted from their own land, they were losing all hope. Imagine, dear listeners, the chaos of those days. From the lush green plains of Valencia to the sunny mountains of Andalusia, tens of thousands of Moriscos were on their way to be deported. All they could take with them were a few belongings and a broken dream in their hearts. Most were deported to North Africa, and even there they were always considered foreigners. Some died of hunger and disease on the way. Others struggled to survive in lands they had never known. And what about Spain? By deporting its own people, it has dealt a severe blow not only to its conscience, but also to its economy. The Moriscos were the lifeblood of Spain's important sectors, such as craftsmanship and agriculture. With their expulsion, agricultural production declined, the land became unproductive, and the vibrancy of commerce in the cities began to fade. Worse still, there was no one to replace the Moriscos. The land never regained its former vitality. The unity and purity demanded by the church opened deep rifts among the people. Society began to give in to fear rather than loyalty to the church. But dear friends, this exile was not limited to material losses. The Moriscos took with them a piece of Spain's history, from the cuisine to the architecture, even the songs. The presence of the Moriscos was one of the cornerstones of Spanish culture. It was like waking up one morning and feeling that part of your soul had disappeared. You could no longer hear the old Andalusian melodies rising from the narrow streets of Spanish cities. With the Moriscos, Spain had lost a richness, a diversity of its own past. But did the expulsion really achieve its purpose? Was Spain now a stronger, more united nation? Or would it be a decision that would be remembered throughout history with deep regret? In our next episode, we will take another step into Spain's future to find the answer to this question. The events that await us hide who knows what secrets in the dark labyrinth of history. Ah, my dear friends, I have seen many turning points in my life, But the story of the Jesuits represents a unique period, a reminder both of the strength of the human will and of the long road traveled for the faith. It was the result of the Catholic Church's effort to reassert its stronghold against the waves of reformism in an age of great turmoil. Let us now take a journey to the roots of this story and witness the birth of the Jesuit order, founded on deep faith and discipline, and how the Church was resurrected through education. S.R. Johann Harhatig. It all began in the first half of the 16th century, when Europe was in the heat of the great religious wars and reform movements were shaking the Catholic world. In the midst of this turmoil, a man named Ignatius Loyola, a former soldier, embarked on a spiritual journey. This Spanish nobleman, whose life had been spent on the battlefield, had retreated into seclusion after suffering a serious injury in Pamplona. But it was in this solitude and pain that he discovered his own soul. He decided to fight not only with his sword, but also with his pen, and vowed to dedicate his life to strengthening the Catholic faith. By 1534, Ignatius and a few close friends gathered on Montmartre Hill in Paris and took an oath to found an order. The Jesuits chose to be called Montmartre de Pierre, literally the Society of Jesus, because their primary purpose was to spread the teaching of Jesus. But dear friends, this was no ordinary order. The Jesuits were individuals endowed with deep discipline, strong faith, and unique intelligence. In their view, knowledge and education were the most powerful weapons if you wanted to frustrate the arguments of the enemies of Christianity. And this is where the Jesuits' efforts in education came into play. This small community soon began to expand, from Spain to Italy, from France to Poland. They were not only teachers, but also missionaries. From the imperial courts to the poorest village schools, they pioneered Catholic education everywhere. They appealed especially to young people, molding their minds in a combination of religion and science. By making them study Latin texts, teaching them the universal language of mathematics, and inculcating ethical philosophy, they produced not only clergy, but also the most learned individuals of their time. But this rise of the Jesuits was not just a struggle for education, my friends. They were seen as a key part of the Counter-Reformation. Members of this order, sent all over Europe, were at the forefront of the resistance to the Protestant movement. Imagine that Jesuit schools were opened even in the Protestant sectarian territories of Germany, where they were trying to bring back to Catholicism those who had begun to join the Reform movement. It was a struggle not only by faith, but also by reason. Imagine those days for a moment. You are in a town square, and there stands a Jesuit priest with a sharp mind and eloquent speeches. His words are the product not only of oratorical skill, but also of deep wisdom. People listen to this man's speeches, looking for salvation in the words that flow from his educated mind. This is how the Jesuits rose, not only as defenders of religion, but also as trusted guides of the community. But dear friends, this story is not only full of victories. In some places, the Jesuits have also encountered great resistance. In particular, their relationship with monarchies sometimes put them under suspicion. Their education and intelligence were seen as a threat not only to the Church, but also to the political balance. What other challenges did this rising power have to overcome to cement its place on the stage of history? Perhaps in the next part of the story we will talk about these confrontations that shaped the fate of the Jesuits and their difficult path. Ah, my dear friends, when you look into Europe's deep past, you sometimes see those turbulent times when the sky turns gray, the land cracks, old beliefs are shaken. What happened in the 16th century was exactly such a storm. The order established by the Catholic Church for centuries was being shaken by reformist winds. People began to seek peace in their own consciences, not in the pews where they knelt before priests and waited for forgiveness. The rise of Protestantism was the fruit of this search, like the sprouting of a tree whose roots are slowly but deeply deepening. It all started in 1517, when Martin Luther nailed his famous theses to the door of Wittenberg Cathedral. To heaven called Andalusians, the transformation of religious practices into a corrupt economic system had begun to disturb consciences in different corners of Europe. What Martin Luther did was nothing more than throw wood on this smoldering fire. Protestantism soon became a new face of Christianity. But my friends, it is important to recognize that this new movement was not only a theological transformation. Protestantism also sparked a process of secularization, the removal of religion from social life and governance. The social and economic strangulation hidden under the old order became more evident in the lands where the new understanding of religion spread. Cities and towns were becoming places where people were introduced to a religious understanding that was both freer and more individualized. This process changed not only the forms of worship, but the whole organization of society. The most significant change took place in Northern Europe. While Germany echoed with Luther's voice, another Protestant wave rose in Switzerland under the guidance of John Calvin. Presbyterians began to appear in Scotland and Anglicans in England. My friends, the establishment of this new order shattered centuries-old traditions. Protestantism shook the majestic pyramid of the church hierarchy and brought the individual believer face to face with God. Luther's idea of salvation by faith had planted in people's hearts a simpler, more direct understanding of relationship. Far from the huge services in the magnificent cathedrals, the communities gathering in small churches or in the corners of the fields were creating a new perception of Christianity. But of course, this process was not easy. Europe experienced the pains of this new order with many bloody wars. While one part of the society embraced Protestantism, the other part remained firmly attached to the old Catholic order. This tension led to long religious wars that were felt in almost every corner of Europe. Massive conflicts, such as the 30 Years' War, were driven not only by religion, but also by the search for economic and political balance. But even in this chaos, Protestantism continued to grow. This process, in which the power of the clergy was weakened, beliefs were liberated, and the individual redefined both God and his or her social role, completely changed the religious order of Northern Europe. Imagine, dear friends, that in your village, all the religious traditions you have believed in for centuries were questioned, that your churches were converted or abandoned altogether. How did people adapt to this new religion and order? How was the once Catholic Europe reshaped by the fierce flame of Protestant ideas? In the next chapter, let us examine together one of the first countries to emerge from this flame of Protestantism, England's wars of religion and the Reformation movement. Ah, my dear friends, as we walk through the deep corridors of time, every stone, every impression has a story to whisper to us. As we leave behind the age of reform and religious conversion, it is impossible not to realize what a profound legacy those turbulent years have left. These great upheavals in almost every corner of Europe are on the stage of history like an architect laying the foundation stones of the modern world. Just imagine, the authority of the Catholic Church for hundreds of years was shaken by the Protestant reforms. This was not just a religious change, but a transformation of a philosophy of life, of a sense of identity. People's view of society, the authority of rulers, even the individual's relationship with God were reshaped. Religious transformations were a major trigger for the formation of nation-states. But the opposition to the centralized power of the Church paved the way for local leaders, princes, and eventually nation-states to establish their independent identities. Protestantism, in particular, strengthened this process with its support for individualism and national identity. Germany's ununited lands, Sweden's Protestant armies, England's Anglican spirit. This fragmented perspective, the centralized identity and initial support for individualism and national identity, the fragmented prestige of the new face of Europe. But my dear friends, the transformation was not limited to the winds of reform from the north. The Iberian Peninsula, namely Spain and Portugal, opted for another path based on religious integration. These lands, where Catholicism was strengthened by the sword and prayer, became a bastion of faith. These rich cultures blended with Islam and Judaism, left indelible traces on the fabric of Europe, even though they were tried to be eradicated after the Reconquista. As the scientific and artistic heritage of Andalusia left the shores of the Mediterranean, it was replaced by the harsh face of religious uniformity. But think, dear listeners, what would Europe's cultural richness have been like without the cultural losses of this region? Could it be that the foundations of modern science today were not at all influenced by the legacy of Spanish and Arab scholars? Just as important as these religious conflicts in the formation of modern Europe was something else: the place of religion in social identity. In the Middle Ages, religion was the strongest bond linking the individual to society. But reforms and transformations did not break this bond. They only redefined it. Christianity became more of an inner journey for individuals and a symbol of pride and unity in the identity of nation-states. Powerful Catholic states like France shaped society through religion, while Protestant countries like England or Sweden turned the church into an apparatus of the state. This has paved the way for a more pragmatic understanding of the place of religion in both political and cultural identity. In those years. In my endless travels from Spain to France, from Germany to England, I felt this transformation at every step. Wherever nation-states developed, kings and monarchs tried to create unity by using the ancient power of religion. But it is important to remember that these efforts were not always successful. Religion is still a cause of division in some regions, while in others it has been a unifying force. This complex tapestry of religion and identity in Europe is a unique guide to understanding today's modern landscape. North Korea, finally, my dear friends, when this storm of religious conversion subsided, Europe saw the rays of a new sun. A gateway was opened to the Age of Enlightenment, with new ideas in philosophy, science, art, and politics. The great chaos of reforms and religious conversions was in fact the first step in Europe's long journey to modernity. But the question always remains in my mind: would Europe have been the same cultural and political power without the internal turmoil of these transformations? Hundreds of years of struggles have shaped the color, smell, and texture of the modern world. But was the price of those dark days too high? Ah, so many stories to tell, so many thoughts to offer you, my dear friends. But at the end of all this journey, one more question arises. Will this modern Europe, shaped by reforms and transformations, grow even more in the light of the Enlightenment? Or will the dark shadows once again take center stage? In my next story, I want to take you into the world of the brilliant minds of the Age of Enlightenment. Are you ready?